Thank you, and welcome to today's program, Deal Making in a Post-COVID World. My name is Mark Pedretti, and I am the Global Head of Private Equity at Reed Smith and a member of our Board of Directors. We have a fantastic lineup of experts from the corporate, financial advisory, and private equity sector who will share their perspectives. This is an inaugural event, Roundtable on Zoom, and judging by the excellent audience turnout, we hope to repeat this event each quarter. Before we begin, a few words on Reed Smith and our moderator, Iqbal Hussain. As to Reed Smith, as many of you know, we are a global relationship law firm with a premier transatlantic life sciences practice featuring over 200 lawyers fully dedicated to the sector. We represent the entire spectrum of life sciences players from major pharma companies, PE and VC houses, and biotech startups, and I'm delighted to report that our team has been quite busy closing deals since the pandemic has started, both private and public ones, and we're eager to hear about the panel's experience. As to our moderator, I'm delighted to introduce my partner and friend, Iqbal Hussain. Iqbal joined Reed Smith last year from Johnson & Johnson, where he served as Legal Director M&A for the EMEA region, and prior to that position, Iqbal served as Senior Counsel for J&J's EMEA Innovation Center in London. Before his time with J&J, Iqbal trained and practiced for a number of years at a Magic Circle firm. And since joining Reed Smith, he's been quite busy closing deals, including for one of our panel firms, GHO Capital, on its platform acquisition of Fair Journey Biologics, and on a subsequent add-on acquisition, and just recently advised York Capital on an acquisition in the sector. So with that, Iqbal, over to you to lead us on.
Well, thank you, Mark, and welcome everyone to this session. We absolutely have a really fantastic panel, as Mark mentioned, and they represent, sort of the strategics, the venture side, as well as the private equity side. So just to introduce our really excellent panel of deal makers, firstly, Johan Verbeeck. So Johan is the VP of Business Development for Immunology at Johnson & Johnson. Johan and I were colleagues for some time. We were at the London Innovation together. Johan, you just give a little wave to the crowd.
Hi, Bill. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. And then to Maria DAHL. So Maria is the head of transactions for oncology business development and licensing at AstraZeneca. And Maria and I, we've known each other for some time, and we've had the good fortune to work together as well. Maria, again, if you could just say hi. Hey, and then Edward Denor, he's an executive partner at GHO Capital. I've been fortunate enough to work with Edward and his team over the last few months on a transaction, and it's great to have you join us as well, Edward. And then Laurence Barker. So Laurence is a partner and CBO at the Dementia Discovery Fund, SV Health Investors. Laurence, prior to that, was at GSK, where I initially met Laurence actually, and sort of, as well as working on a number of other things, Laurence and I worked together in establishing the Dementia Discovery Fund a few years back. So welcome, Laurence. And then last but not least, James West. So James is a director at Results Healthcare, and sort of he's been very busy with a lot of activity for biotechs, and it would be great to get James's perspective here today as well. So welcome to the panel and welcome to the audience. So I think before we get on to the, sort of the main topic of discussion today, as we have two prominent strategics being represented here, I guess start off with Johan. So Johan, what's happening with the vaccine?
Well, first of all, hello everybody, and thanks for the kind introduction, Iqbal. It's great to be here. It feels at least halfway normal to be in a panel again, even though it looks a bit different than the panels we used to do. And hopefully they will come back, and hopefully that will be supported by a vaccine. So yes, We are very actively engaged in discovery of vaccine, as is Maria's company, AstraZeneca, and honestly, I think the world will need a couple vaccines, not just one in one company, and that's not really what this is about. I think we've been public that we are accelerating our development efforts. We're starting our phase 1/2A in the next couple of days in Belgium, actually. We're using our AdVac technology, which is an adenovirus platform. I think one of the things that stems me hopeful is that this is a proven technology. We recently had approval in EMEA for an Ebola vaccine on that very same platform, which is also based on the Percy 6 cell line that we acquired through the acquisition of Crucell so many years ago, and which has a very good yield. So our plan is to have close to 1 billion or more than 1 billion vaccines, doses of vaccine available during the course of next year. Hopefully as early as the start of next year. We're doing everything we can to beef up the production capacity it takes to do that in a global fashion. But so far so good. It's looking promising, I would say.
Great, thank you, Johan. And Maria, I'm going to have to trouble you with the same question. I think it would be great to hear how AZ is getting on.
No, with great pleasure, and thanks, Johan, for also introducing sort of the topic. AstraZeneca is, as Johan mentioned, also active in supporting the development of vaccines. And it's not an area AstraZeneca has been very heavily involved in prior to this epidemic, but the company really felt it was the right thing to do for patients to be involved. So we are currently supporting a phase 2/3 clinical trial in more than 10,000 patients globally with a vaccine which we have licensed from Oxford University and Vacitech, which is a spin-out from Oxford. As Johan said, it's important that there are many groups and companies involved in this initiative to try to develop a vaccine. This is such a serious disease. So we are certainly hoping that one of them will work, and including, of course, our own, and so that there can be some kind of return to normal.
Yeah, great. And I think we're all eagerly anticipating to hear the outcome on next Monday. I think it's a big day for AZ and Oxford. And thank you very much for doing all the great job that you do and all your colleagues at AZ and J&J. It's we're all certainly counting on you. I say all except perhaps New Zealand. Talking of which, turning to Laurence. And Laurence, I won't mention the fact that it's a year and 2 days to the Cricket World Cup final, when England beat a certain nation, but leaving that aside.
Thank you for mentioning that, yes.
Leaving that aside, so look, obviously, I know you've been extremely busy on the VC side. There has been a lot of activity, and actually, as we look at the market, certainly when it comes to fundraising, a number of VC investors have been extremely busy and raised a large amount of money on both sides of the Atlantic. So we've seen LSP, Atlas Ventures, and then on the device side, Gilder Healthcare as well. So certainly on the fundraising side, it seems like it's been busy, and as I understand it, all of them have been oversubscribed. But from your experience in terms of as a fund that's really been focused on your portfolio and your investment side, how has COVID-19 impacted you?
Thank you, Iqbal. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think, from our perspective, we are an early stage venture investor, and we took pause initially to work out what impact it was having on our portfolio. I think everyone did, to work out whether, in fact, you need to reserve extra capital just to ensure that your own portfolio might move forward in a time when it was very unclear whether companies could raise and in what way they might raise. I think, though, that was perhaps the first month. what we are seeing and what we've been involved in is actually almost venture investing as it was previously. We've been very busy indeed, and that's not just in supporting and doing subsequent rounds for our portfolio, but actually in doing new deals as well. And that was a surprise. And we've closed 3 new deals, in fact, therefore more in a 6-month period or a 4-month period, I suppose, to be focused on the area we're talking about than the same time last year, for example. So that hasn't let up at all. I think there are a couple of points that are important to make, though, and that's maybe pause for how we think about the future, certainly from our perspective, is one, almost all of those relationships had been initiated prior to the lockdown. So, whether at JP Morgan or even prior thereto, I think none of these so far have come out of, relationships we'd established, well, quite frankly, on Zoom. And so how that will play through the back half of the year and into next, I think is an interesting question to explore. Maybe that comes back to some degree back to the whole discussion about practicality in the way we operate and the way we might operate differently. So I think holistically, we've seen a lot of activity, even in the early stage space. I think the 2 points that I would say, which we are seeing a difference of, is the way people are thinking about, certainly in the early stage space, funding companies. I think the big question always is, you fund to value inflection, you fund to milestones. But I think the extra consideration right now is if this environment continues, and if in fact, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, if in fact the markets change and the sentiment changes, then when actually might you be able to raise again? And whether you're talking an early stage startup or, Ceravance just closed a 65 million oversubscribed Series B, one of our star companies, I would argue, they still are unsure about when the next round they might be able to close will come, and whether people's, buoyancy, positivity that's currently out there will change. So I think people are also considering straightforward runway more acutely and more focused than they might have previously. So even in seed rounds, the ones that we're involved in are a little larger, they're heavily tranched, but they potentially give the company a longer runway until they need to raise again. And I think that's certainly a trend that we've noted because of that whole question about when you might come through again. So they're just some initial thoughts about the way we're seeing it. But I think the overall message is, even in our space of dementia funding, early stage companies in dementia, which is, fundamentally an underfunded area, it's not immuno-oncology, then even there, things have moved forward really quite actively, which from my perspective is great.
Great, thank you, Laurence. And that's some really interesting thought there, particularly when there's a lot of issues around the wider market and people being concerned with deal making. And certainly, biotechs as well have been very busy on the IPO front as well. We've had some very notable IPOs, Legends, Mytech, Royalty Pharma, etc. Inari on the device side. So I think that's consistent with just the general view as well. Talking of which, I guess turning to Edward, obviously from a PE perspective, I know obviously you've been extremely busy. Are you seeing the market in a similar fashion to Laurence in terms of how buoyant it is, or are you experiencing it slightly differently?
Well, I think to the extent we're experiencing it differently, Iqbal, it's just because of where we are in the market. So I'll put some context around that. So we're a mid-market private equity investor, and we focus on really growing platforms that are in the enablement industry. So for example, the transaction we worked on together, Iqbal, Fair Journey Biologics is a contract research organization. They're providing antibody discovery services to biopharma, right? So that is very typical of portfolio companies that we operate. And we seek to grow those platforms. So we seek to take advantage of our transatlantic capabilities to help our European businesses grow into the North American market, and help North American businesses discover the old world over here. And in that process, be able to serve kind of the broader biopharma community across more of the global kind of clinical value chain. So that does involve M&A strategies. It does involve financing strategies. And so I think, to Laurence's point, I would echo. So we've closed, since lockdown, we've closed 5 deals in the portfolio. We've signed our 6th deal, which is the largest ever deal GH has ever done. which will close hopefully in the next month. And with Mark's help, we may sign exclusivity on our 7th deal during lockdown. But then echoing Laurence's comments, every one of these are people that we've known before lockdown, and we were just able to, in a sense, keep going. Lots of lessons learned. Some things were less efficient than they would be ordinarily. And you rack your brain about how to get your heads around problems that normally you would solve in a room. But you get there with perseverance. I think to your question on valuations, Iqbal, I'm not really sure that we've seen a huge difference there. What we've seen is a bit of froth come out of the market. So the incremental competitive pressures in a process kind of get lifted when people don't know the situation as well as you know it. So perhaps there's a slight advantage there, but fundamentally it hasn't really changed the way that we do deals. I think we're continuing to see a progression in the portfolio. We, like Laurence, took a pause at the very beginning to kind of reflect and figure out where things were going to head. We did that sort of January, February. By March, I think we had operating plans and scenarios plans and capital plans. But I think the other difference is the debt markets for us are trickier now than they would have been before, because debt investors are diversified. So we tend to over-equitize our deals, which is helpful because we're growing the platforms. But private equity firms who rely more on debt are finding the incremental availability tricky, because those debt funds are exposed to property and retail and restaurants and all sorts of other areas that are not performing as well as healthcare and technology. So yeah, we've not really slowed down at all, and don't plan to for the rest of the year.
Well, that's great, and we hope to continue helping you in doing that as well. Turning to, I suppose that those are really interesting perspectives, and Johan, one of the things that I guess we've seen less of, in the market world, we've seen a lot of deal making in the private equity, and as Laurence has said, also the VC end has been very busy. We have clearly seen deals in the big strategics, but perhaps a slowdown versus what we're accustomed to seeing, and certainly no really giant M&A deals being announced. From a strategic perspective, can you just talk us through how you see it? I'm just giving a perspective on how we're seeing the overall market, but has your perspective on deal making changed? Are there anything such as Edward mentioned valuation, for example? Is valuation a particular concern? And just the logistics of doing deals from a strategic perspective, particularly later stage deals where it's very important to obviously if you like to test what you're buying. So if you could just talk us through some of that would be great. Yeah.
So first of all, I don't know anybody in this line of work who says I'm less busy. The answer you get is I'm busier than ever. So that's sort of a discrepancy versus what is effectively a lower output. I mean, there has been a lower output in licensing and large M&A as you just told us. So what is that then? We're all busier, but there's less output. And to me, that comes down to it has gotten a little harder on multiple fronts, I think. And I wouldn't say not so much negotiations with partners. That goes pretty fine. I mean, Zoom is almost as good a tool, I would say, as a live meeting. It's not really, but it's coming close. It's more about creating alignment, internal alignment. I mean, there's just these natural conversations that otherwise happen at the water cooler are gone, right? And we have stumbled on a couple occasions on things where I thought he or she thought that, and it turns out that person didn't think that, and that would not have happened in the past, and it creates a little bit of resistance, and it delays our timelines a little bit. So that's one. Secondly, I think it has obviously increased nervousness. I mean, there's no doubt. And I'm actually, if you look at the markets today, and to what Laurence and Mark just said, it's stunning, these valuations. If you look at the XBI index, biotech as a whole, it's higher now than pre-COVID. I mean, it's effectively higher than it was before the pandemic hit. That means that whenever you look at a company now, you're looking at the valuation and you're saying, will this hold up or not? I think as time goes on, it seems more and more, in my opinion, that these valuations are indeed supported. But there was certainly an effect a number of weeks and months ago that, I mean, treasuries were pumping money in the system like you wouldn't believe it to shore up these markets. So you were looking at something where you said, is this real or not? And that in itself created a lot of dialogue that we had to have to get comfortable. I think we're getting past that phase, which is good. But the combination of these things, uncertainty, and the third element of uncertainty that I would like to bring up is timing. Clinical trials. I mean, it seems something trivial, but it's actually a very important component of valuation, as you well know, Iqbal. And as soon as you start to assume slippage there by months and even years because of COVID, that's going to impact valuations. And when you do a bottom-up analysis, you'll see a major impact of that. I think when in the beginning of this 3 months ago, we were assuming quite some impactful events or quite some impact on timing. I think now today that's starting to look better again as well. So I think even though we've all been working very hard, we're working on dealing with those uncertainties. And I believe that in the weeks and months ahead, you're going to see the output of that. Now, I completely agree with Laurence and Mark that all of these deals stem to interactions that have been held at JP Morgan or even Bio last year, wherever you had it. None of them seem to be new interactions at this point. And that's an important question that maybe we can debate later on in this session. But so that's why on the one hand, I think the workload has been there, but the output has been decreased. It comes down to a factor of uncertainty and issues to create alignment.
Yeah.
Right.
Johan, on your third point, it's very interesting what you say, because we have a portfolio company who develops assays and runs samples in clinical trials. And as we were looking into this in February, and we remember what happened with SARS in 2003, we were very much frightened of the prospects of what happens if all the clinical trials get delayed. You know, their business will evaporate essentially if there's no samples to run. And you know, it's really been incredible how resilient the clinical trial industry has become in getting sites operational and qualified and getting people trained up and getting those trials going. Because I mean, as we see now with that portfolio company, they're actually running ahead of their original pre-COVID budget, which is, it's good to see. And I saw something come out on Fierce this morning saying there was a study that said clinical trials were kind of back on track overall. So I think there is some encouraging news there.
There's actually a great biomarker that you just mentioned there, these clinical samples. You know, what you saw in the market, I think, was 3-4 months ago, a bunch of biotech companies, you know, did press releases and say, well, wait a minute, this is going to have an impact so and so on our clinical development timelines. A number of them are backpedaling that now and say, well, we actually overestimated, which is a good thing. I think it's better to be cautious rather than the reverse. But we as an industry, as deal makers, had to deal with that, of course.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Right. And Maria, I guess just picking up on that particular issues with the difficulties of, you know, sort of doing due diligence, etc. From your perspective, I know you did a deal with Ascent with our good friend Shakti Narayan over there, which you know, congratulations for getting something like that done within you know, the confines of what we have now. But you know, from your perspective, do you see that you know, certainly for strategic players like yourselves, that given where we are and given the logistical issues, the diligence issues, that a lot of focus is now moving towards, I guess, increase in partnership. I mean, partnership in whatever guise, whether it's a joint venture, whether it's, you know, collaborations, etc. And I mean, these collaborations, partnerships, etc. has always been a big part of the pharma world. But, you know, do you see this as becoming even more the case as we go forward? Or do you see that actually, you know, sort of this is something that you would have done anyway, and this is the way that you would have, you know, sort of done business with, you know, sort of partners like Ascent in any event, and that when it comes to M&A, you know, when the time is right, that the M&A will just pick up again?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. So, I mean, from AstraZeneca perspective, and I believe that's the case of really most companies in our space, we do business development and do the deals really to sort of fill needs within the portfolio, and these needs will be there regardless of COVID-19, and as long as there are unmet medical needs, right? And we have the objective to treat patients and find medicines. So epidemic or not, there will be a need to do deals because we do need to fill pipeline gaps and complement our portfolio, and likewise in some cases externalize opportunities. And thank you for mentioning the deal with Accent Therapeutics, which is a really good example of such a fit with sort of a strategic interest, in as much as AstraZeneca has been interested in the epigenetic space, and in this case particular RNA modifying proteins for quite some time, and we did a very thorough review of the landscape and sort of who were the key players, and found that working with Accent would be a very good fit with AstraZeneca. Coming back to the point made by Laurence and others, we had met the Accent team before, and so we knew the players, met them in person, but the whole negotiation was done online. The due diligence was done online, and we still feel very comfortable that we've done a very good win-win deal in this particular case. So from our perspective, of course, we can in no way say that it's been business as usual, because of course it hasn't. Like our R&D labs have been affected, as somebody said, the clinical trials have been slowed down. There's been massive impact. But in terms of sort of identifying opportunities which sort of fulfill our needs and sort of address our wish to address unmet medical needs, that has sort of continued very much unchanged. I myself work in oncology, but that's also the case for my colleagues in biopharmaceuticals, and Kumar Srinivasan's team. They did a very interesting deal with Silence Therapeutics, which was also announced during the spring. So that work has continued and been very effective. And going forward, I think what drives companies like ours, and I would be the same for Johan and others here, is again the unmet medical need will continue to be there, whether it's in oncology or any other disease. That doesn't go away, right? And we'll just have to adapt to find a way to address it. But clearly, in situations where actually there has to be physical work done, where people actually can't physically be in a place either to do an experiment in a lab, clearly that is a negative result. But we have found ways to still move forward.
No, great, and I think you sort of what's great is, as you say, you were able to conduct all of the due diligence virtually, and overall, sort of the negotiations went absolutely fine. There's a lot of talk, not just in this industry, but more generally, that working virtually, working from home, it's kind of the new norm. Sort of in a world where we've got a vaccine and we're moving forward, I guess sort of I get the impression that people will be certainly more comfortable doing more sessions, doing diligence, etc. virtually. And actually a lot of that, it's not new, right? It's people have been doing virtual due diligence a lot. It's just we've not been able to do site visits and things like that. Do you see this going forward, that this will become maybe not the norm, but at least a tool that's used more frequently than it is now, but with a mixture of the old ways of doing business, which is having the meetings and things, or do you think this will actually become the new norm of just doing it via Zoom?
So I think there would be much increased use of these virtual tools. And I would also maybe, if you forgive me, say a word about China, which is an area sort of we work a lot with our colleagues out in China, and where simply due to the distance, we have had to use virtual tools for quite a long time, because we just don't go on a plane as easily as we would do for a deal with a French company, sometimes Boston. And that is an area where we've already, to a large extent, done a lot of previous due diligence and deal negotiations, virtually to avoid traveling. And so going forward, Iqbal, to your question, yeah, it will be used increasingly for China negotiations and non-China negotiations. It has been proven, as I think Johan said, as to be a very effective tool to use sort of Zoom and others. So and it will, a lot of people I think would rather not travel than travel, right? So that is something which will help us save time and be productive. But having said that, I think I do look forward to vaccine hopefully coming soon, and us being able to go to other continents and build relationships with our particular Asian colleagues, American colleagues. As you will all know, the world doesn't stand still. There's while there is an epidemic also in other parts of the world. It's been interesting to see, coming back to China, where the whole pandemic started there, but they now have it largely under control and sort of operating in many ways normal. How active they have been, both in deal making and also on raising funds. And to build on some of the comments made by Laurence and Edward, right, out in China, as you know very well, there's been a lot of private equity raised. Just last a few days ago, there were 3 listings on Hong Kong, right? So, and there's a lot of deal making as well out there. So while we're still sort of fighting what we call the first or second wave here out there, it's now, while not completely under control, certainly more back to normal, and you see they're very active in terms of investment, deal making, and other areas.
Right, and I guess on the same topic, Laurence and Edward, you're both in a sort of operate in a world where it's not just about doing the deals, but also about then managing these portfolio companies, and much of that is also about relationship building. How do you see that going forward? Because for both VC investment as well as private transactions, it's sort of the management team and backing that management team is incredibly important. Do you feel that we will soon and it's necessary to go back to a normal way of doing business, or do you feel that through the use of interactive tools such as Zoom, you're able to not only do the deals but also effectively manage your portfolio company? Maybe Edward, you want to start, and then Laurence, if you can share your perspective there.
Sure. I think it's very challenging to manage a global portfolio without being able to go and spend time with them. So we tend to underwrite our investments to grow about 3 times in size during our ownership period. So companies growing 3x in 5 years, let's say on average, through combinations of investment in people, systems, so OpEx investment, plant capacity expansions, CapEx investment, and through M&A. And that's all cross-border. So we're doing that routinely on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think it's very difficult to get your head around, people's capacity to follow and lead in those complex strategies. If you can't really sort of colloquially walk the plant with them, right, and really kind of understand how they see things, and where are they stretched, where are the bottlenecks. And I think it's very hard to assess that through the formality of something like Zoom, right? Because here you've planned a time, there's a half hour in the diary, you've got an agenda, they've got an agenda, you cover the points, you move on. Whereas if you go spend half a day with somebody, you learn things you'll never learn over Zoom, right? And so I think it's quite challenging actually managing a portfolio this way. I think what we have found is, in order to approximate what we were doing before, we spend a lot more time at more levels. So more people at GHO spending more times at multiple levels of the organization on shorter calls rather than kind of a big summit. You have dozens of smaller calls ongoing, right? That are sort of deeper dives into an area, like, you know, how are we doing on our LIMS system? What's happening, you know, in the warehouse? What's happening with our lab, you know, capacity increase, et cetera, right? And so those are the kind of things that we have to routinely deal with, where, you know, if you get to walk the hallways, you see the people, you can hear what they have to say, and you can make adjustments along the way. So it is challenging. That being said, all of our portfolio companies have learned from this, and all of them are going to make permanent adjustments to the way they operate going forward. So, for example, some of our lab businesses who thought, okay, if I want to double capacity, I need double the lab benches, actually are now thinking, well, maybe I run 2 shifts, and even if it's not 100% increase, it's maybe at least a 50% increase. So I don't need as much new lab space because actually my employees like that flexibility. So there are new working models that are emerging, and we will never go back to normal that way. We've got cameras installed for QA, so we have, you know, the likes of, you know, Janssen and AZ doing inspections in some of our facilities remotely, which is amazing. They can, because of that, it's actually better because they can do it more often and more ad hoc. So from their standpoint, actually you may have better visibility into how the organization is performing for you versus before, when you know, registered your interest in coming for a visit and planned it 2 weeks in advance, and then, right? So, and then they kind of, you know, make sure the floor is clean before you get there, right? So I think there's been some changes, but it is a challenge, Iqbal. It's a real challenge.
Okay. Laurence?
Yeah, so I would agree with much of that sentiment. I mean, just to start with that latter topic, we've had a couple of companies who've been very creative about getting people in the lab, but obviously having to be socially distanced and minded. And so actually creating 2 shifts a day and offering people the flexibility to do one or the other. And actually that's gone down really well. So the work is getting done. It's just not getting done in the same manner it was before. And actually the CEO of one company I was talking to this morning thinks actually they've been more effective in their lab work in the last 4 months than they were, you know, the equivalent time last year. So it's forced people to be creative, but actually it's probably better in the long run. But I think that the point about maintaining and developing relationships with the portfolio, I think is tricky if you're just doing it virtually. It's, you know, where either you're building a relationship for the first time because you've just made investment with the management team and the company's got to grow, or you've built a larger syndicate and you're trying to do it at the board level. And of course, the answer is you've got to do both. Then just to do it virtually is a real challenge. And I think from my perspective, if I look at the new deals we've been doing, you know, at the moment we're making do with the fact we're having to do this virtually, but you miss out on all of the additional interactions, you know, the board dinner, you know, it's such a valuable time to build the broader relationships. And they, as you exactly said, Edward, to go beyond the facts, but to talk about the context, the environment, to build, you know, I think this, at the end of the day, all comes down to trust. And to do that, you need to spend time with people and work out where they're coming from and how we can all, you know, at the end of the day, focus and gel around a unified view of where the company needs to go and how we each need to contribute. So I think, you know, this, from my perspective, I don't think this is an optimal model for the future. I think a blend of the two. You know, like in my mind, it was, you know, every second board meeting, maybe you could do like this, but really every other then you need to try and get face to face. And particularly where you just are still developing those relationships. And I think the one thing that I've certainly done with 2 of mine is actually to have more frequent meetings. So back again about touching base on different topics with different people. Instead of meeting once a quarter, we've had, in some cases, monthly, but much shorter, 90 minutes, 1 hour, 90 minutes, and not your 5 hours every quarter, because actually it's been much closer to help them out, but also people are then focused. You get people's attention, everyone knows what's talking, you know, 5 hours on Zoom just doesn't work. Well, at least it doesn't for me anyway. So breaking that up, and that's working much better. And I think those models will start to adopt. But I think just doing things virtually is difficult. And I'm still talking about portfolio companies where almost everyone, English is the first language. You know, I think some of the comments about China and certainly in my prior life doing a lot of work in Japan, I think that's much more challenging to do if you haven't got a really established, strong working relationship with the groups. So just a few observations.
No, thank you. And I guess turning to you, James, just a slightly broader question, because I think you have a very broad overview of the market, given your practice. What's your just general take on the real impact that COVID has had on sort of deal landscape, sort of overall?
Yeah, thanks. You're right. We've got a reasonable amount of visibility, particularly in the mid-market in pharma life sciences. Interesting to hear everyone's views here, and absolutely echo. The 7 or 8 deals that our business have closed since lockdown have all been where there's been a relationship, prior to that, and then it's a lot of that kind of second half of a deal with the diligence and legal aspects to close something out. Those are kind of later stage deals. There's deals which are kind of in the middle somewhere. And normally if there's been a meeting and it's kind of those final stages, we're still seeing the tail end of those deals complete. It's the earlier stage deals which there was definitely a big gap from not being able to meet face to face, people unsure about what they're doing, investors focusing on their portfolios, debt markets being having to reconsider what they'd be able to offer. And I think we're just about, over the last kind of few weeks or so, starting to see sentiment come back. So we're seeing processes starting to launch again. And it was interesting, I was on the phone to an investor in the mid-market earlier this morning who mentioned he was actually in Heathrow, flying across to Amsterdam to meet a company that he was on the verge of closing a deal with. But that was one where it's been all virtual up to this point, but there was that roadblock of having to meet someone. And from everyone that I speak to, sellers as well as buyers and investors, that definitely seems to be still on the critical path. I think, Johan, like you mentioned, Zoom is great, 95% of that communication you can do, but I think it still remains key to meet people face to face.
Absolutely, thank you. And I hope he was wearing a mask as he was doing his travels. So Johan, maybe turning slightly to deal terms. I think what we've certainly seen, as lawyers, as we've been advising our clients, as well as the practical difficulties on diligence, there has been a lot more focus on sort of business performance within that due diligence exercise. And then when it comes to deal terms, a lot more, focus on sort of deal protection, things like break fees, and MAC clauses, which I know in the US, MAC clauses are, routinely accepted. Over in Europe, the market dynamic is different. But from a sort of a US perspective, and I appreciate you do deals obviously globally, but how have you found the market over there? Are you finding that people are sort of insisting on certain things that you hadn't seen before, or is it business as usual, or is there more emphasis on any particular thing from your perspective?
The short answer really is it's business as usual. I mean, and I will indeed comment on the United States. And it's of course driven by the valuation that we discussed earlier. As long as you don't see a magnificent change there, your terms are not going to meaningfully change. It was because one is connected to the other. It just comes back to what I said about uncertainty and projecting forward. That has been maybe a reason why terms have been put more hesitantly on the table, or it took longer to put them on the table because it just required more thinking, more analysis, and more alignment. But other than that, I can't say that I've seen a change in the very process of the negotiation and the deal terms itself. I'm interested to hear Maria's point on that, but that's one thing. The second thing is, let's not forget, I mean, doing deals, that's a lengthy cycle, right? I always wish we could do a deal in a month, but the truth, unfortunately, is that it's often months and months and sometimes close to a year. And there's examples where it's been longer. So the real impact, we probably haven't seen even of this, given that, how long has this been going now? 4 or 5 months. So it's probably still a little too soon to tell. I don't feel a change right now. I've also not seen, to another part of your question, additional requests that came in to say, hey, we need this or that because of COVID. It's nothing really that I can think about. that would entail that. So it is a little bit business as usual. But again, it's still early day when you think about the cycles of deal making, which tend to be very lengthy.
Right, and Maria, sort of Johan would love to hear your view. So would I, from in terms of Europe and how you found it, whether you see sort of any particular impact.
Yeah, I agree with Johan, and sort of coming back to the point I made before. I mean, AstraZeneca, and I know that's also the case of J&J. I mean, we're in this business to develop drugs and products which meet unmet medical needs, right? And we do deals which are very around opportunities and products which are very early in development, high risk, and we do some late stage deals, and we value them accordingly. And COVID or not, right? In most of the cases for the deals we're looking at, the opportunity hasn't really changed much because of COVID in terms of the particular unmet medical needs. And I'm speaking here because I work in oncology, right? But it will probably be the same in autoimmune disorders and things like that. So like Johan, in terms of the deal terms, we are contemplating and the kind of deals we're doing and conclude the terms we go ahead with, they're very similar to what we would do under normal circumstances, because they're driven really by the inherent value of the opportunity, which has not really changed much because of COVID. I think maybe a discussion to be had in another forum is, of course, because of the cost the epidemic or pandemic has had to governments, we may see price pressures, and I think that is something we all need to be very aware of, that the impact on government's budgets, right, and insurance budgets going forward, and that will potentially have an impact on value of deals and opportunities, but we are not there at the moment, and we basically structured deals to make them win-win for the partner, look at sort of adjust according to the risk and how much sort of cash we're willing to expose, and then of course want to make sure that it's something which generates value for both parties.
The pricing point is a very, if I may, Iqbal, the pricing point is a very good one, I think, Maria, and certainly in the United States is confounded by the upcoming presidential elections, which just are, another layer of insecurity that comes on top of everything else, right? That we'll somehow have to deal with, and that we're trying to factor in. And nobody has a crystal ball what's going to happen there, but it probably has an impact.
It is interesting, right? Because COVID, in a way, has given the whole industry an opportunity to put its best foot forward. And, we see it in our portfolio. We see it with your guests here today, Iqbal. But at the same time, I think the market is positioned, the traders are all positioned in the equity markets as though COVID is a temporary thing. And one day it's going to be behind us. And so if you want to buy my company, you have to pay the price, right? So the valuations haven't come down, even though the forward earnings projections may have. And so that's where the market's positioned. And I think fundamentally, one day someone's going to true up this COVID bill, and it's going to land at somebody's end of the table, and it's going to have to get paid, right? And they'll have to figure out how to divvy it up. And I don't think people have figured that out yet. I don't think, certainly it's going to hit governments, but governments are going to turn to, all of us as personal taxpayers, as corporations, as, right, some way, shape, or form, they're going to turn to us to kind of recoup some of it. And until we kind of see where that bill lands, I think it's going to be very hard for people to, guess. I think fundamentally, because healthcare is really putting its best foot forward here, we may find ourselves slightly more insulated than other industries.
So all good points. The one thing I'm really thinking about, I don't have an answer to it, is the amount of investment right now in COVID research is, of course, phenomenal. And if you look at the output of papers, there was an overview paper last week. It's phenomenal how much science has been written around COVID right now. And unfortunately, you'll see a reduction in the remainder of the science that otherwise is being researched to some extent. How is that going to impact company formation and NUCO formation in the future? I wonder. I mean, I've seen quite a few NUCOs who simply come up from scientists talking in a lab to each other and coming up with an idea and going to a VC and say, hey, here's my idea. What do you think? how is that going to be impacted? If even for existing companies, I can't tell you how many emails I got from CEOs who said over the last months, I have a drug here that was not designed for COVID, but we think it may work. You know, so even there you see that happening, that people are looking into the amount of funding that's being bubbled up there and say, can we tap into that? And I think all those intentions are really, really good, but that can have a tremendous long-term impact on the industry, I think. And I have to say, I think, because I don't know, I've been probably wrong in everything in this that I told 3-4 months ago, but it's a question to ask.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's definitely a fair point. And also, you know, there's an incredible amount of government funding that's going into sort of COVID-related activities, not just on the therapeutics, but also on the devices, device side, detection, etc. And yes, I completely agree with you. You do wonder, you know, sort of once we've got our vaccine, once we've got devices that identify COVID very easily, and we've got the, you know, sort of COVID under control globally, what is the long-term or at least the medium-term impact on, you know, the rest of therapeutic areas, the rest of diseases? Just keeping an eye on the time, I'll just open up to questions shortly. Maybe one last question for each of you to answer, and that is, you know, sort of, what is from your perspective, you know, what do you see as the long-term impact here? And, you know, in a post-COVID world, how do you see deal making evolve in the life sciences sector? So maybe, Johan, as you're on the screen, why don't we start with you, and then we will get everyone's perspective there.
I think I just hinted at it. I mean, what impact is it going to have on long-term research and new co-formation? Because let's, I mean, everything aside, that's what we need. You know, if that stops, then you have a problem. And I think to the point that Edward made earlier, in healthcare, we're probably still pretty safe. Imagine you're in an industry that has nothing to do with healthcare and you're banking on government funds. Let's say green energy and stuff like that. I mean, oh my God, who has attention for that right now? Or at least there will have been a lot of drainage of attention. So I hope that in the long run, that's not affecting our industry too much. How that will affect deal making in itself, I can't say. I mean, if valuations remain the way they are, and if pricing remains the way it is, then the industry will remain, then deal making, I think, will remain unchanged for the foreseeable future. In the long run, it will depend on what we see coming out of the research labs and how it is translated into inventions that can serve human health.
Thank you. And Edward, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, just to take Johan's comments forward on valuation, I do think, you know, valuations have been pumped in this sector, but I think they've been pumped because the sector's made a lot of progress. If you consider all of the technology that's now available to the biopharma industry globally, in terms of being able to get drugs to market better, faster, cheaper, dealing with orphan conditions and other things. I mean, there's just a lot more possibility today than there was, you know, even 2 or 3 years ago. And things seem more within reach, whether you're looking at oncology or rare disease, or even kind of better treatments for conditions that are routinely treated today. So I think that what we've seen is a relatively benign environment with hospitals and payers willing to adopt these therapies. And I think so long as we continue to see that, we'll continue to see buoyant deal activity. I think when people start pushing back and say, well, we'll treat the top 10 rare diseases, but we can't afford any more than that, or you have to start cutting your drugs. And so the implications backwards through the pipeline are probably where I'd watch out and say, well, you know, maybe the first, you know, 20 or so gene therapies will make it and get the pricing they want, and everybody after that's going to really struggle. So so I think there are some pressures coming up, but right now I think we're in a situation where hope is fueling and science is fueling a lot of the growth, as opposed to just plain money flowing into the market, right? I think there's a reason behind it.
Great. And James, your perspective here?
Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting point, Edward, you mentioned just on money flowing into the market. It's definitely something we've seen about that supply and demand balance. I think we're all very fortunate to work in healthcare, life science, and pharma. And it's something we've noticed that, there's definitely some sectors out there for generalist investors in particular, which are pretty much or could be considered uninvestable at this time. If you're thinking about travel, leisure, retail, they're very, very cautious sectors. And we're seeing definitely a shift in people's focus, particularly into our sector. Now, how long that will continue beyond the first couple of years, we'll see. But hopefully it trickles down not only into kind of where we act, which is the mid-market, but also what you're mentioning, Johan. Hopefully some of those fundraisers and people's attention going also into the VCs and into those early lab discussions. Hopefully that will continue to bring that forward.
Great. And Maria?
Yeah, so just maybe starting with a couple of things, which I think the positive things which have come out of COVID-19, right, and this whole epidemic, and which will impact us going forward is, I think, as has already been said by some, is there's much more increased collaboration, and you see both in terms of doing clinical trials, joint protocols, and people really getting together to solve a big problem the world has in the medical area. I'm hoping going forward that we, as a community, this pharma, biotech, venture capital, and all of us, sort of the kind of people around this Zoom, will be sort of maybe more forward-looking, because one thing is that we react to COVID coming in, that we can be able, maybe we should be seeing these kind of things coming ahead of time, and then leverage what we've learned now in terms of rapidly developing diagnostics and to be quicker to get ourselves organized next time another epidemic like this comes around, right? So I think we've learned a lot from COVID-19 in terms of how it will impact us going forward. We'll see a lot more deal making, both in terms of just more partnerships, collaborating, sharing technologies, right, to solve big problems for us all, right? And hopefully, infectious disease will now be back and become an area of investment, right? It doesn't have to be just Bill and Melinda Gates and a handful of others who support this. It has to be all of us. And it was interesting, the comment made, I think by you, Johan, saying how people came to you with things they now can see can be used for infectious disease, right, including COVID. I think we need to be much more aware of what things can be used in different areas of disease, right? And collaborate, repositioning, so we can rapidly solve new diseases as they emerge, and in the case we can't foresee them. So I'm positive in terms of outlook. We've learned a lot from this epidemic, which is obviously still ongoing. I think we will work more together, and hopefully the whole borders between different disciplines, and again coming back to Johan's comment about repositioned drugs, right? Hopefully the borders will be more fluid between disciplines, right? So we can use tools developed for one disease and one problem to another problem as it arises, and simply because we cannot, however smart we all are, predict everything, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Laurence, very quickly, 30 seconds. What do you think?
So I think obviously seconding many things that people have said, I think we need to see, though, we need to reflect on the learnings we have from the way we've reacted to this as an industry, to actually apply that to other areas, right? To be much more collaborative, but collaborative with different stakeholders that go beyond the boundaries of the normal industry. As many of you will know, Kate Bingham, my boss, is actually the chair of the UK Vaccines Initiative, and the comments she makes all the time is about pulling people from different disciplines to tackle the problem. And so that echoes, I think, what Maria is saying, but perhaps take it even more broadly than that, which is that certainly we've tried to do in dementia, because actually there's a much broader stakeholder set here. And, I think we're starting to do that with this, but we've been forced by the pandemic. So I think we need to think much more broadly about the way we tackle some of these diseases in the future. Great,
thank you. And I see actually we've only just received one question so far from the panel. So, that's an indication of the great comments you've all made. You've silenced everyone. Maybe just turning to, let me see, is the question. Oh, okay. This question has come from my tax partner, Gareth Amdor. I could have relied Gareth asking a question. Gareth, if you could just ask your question very quickly.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Iqbal. So we've been sort of touching around the area of it, comments made by Edward and a few others. Mine's sort of a policy question. We've obviously seen a lot of monetary policy, money going into the economy, and fiscal policy with some money already going into this sector from the government for COVID reasons, and lots of talk and comment about where government spend in terms of funding and tax cuts might come in fiscal policy to re-stimulate the economy. So I suppose my question to the panel is, if it was up to the panel, what policy measures would you be thinking about introducing to support the life sciences and healthcare sectors further, and so at the same time help the sort of world global economy as a whole?
Trust a tax lawyer to ask a question like that. Maria, do you want to have a go at answering that one?
In terms of policies to be introduced, I mean, I think overall, I think the key is that there's a government industry cooperation, right, and collaboration throughout. I think that's the key. The piece that the government has to be actively involved, but by active that doesn't mean by necessarily by rules, but facilitating sort of the industry work of the industry so that we can rapidly react to problems, right? With incentives. I mean, of course, what we've seen in the UK in particular in terms of policies, as also and government intervention has been good, supporting businesses, smaller businesses, which have had to stop work and R&D work. That has been helpful, but more going forward, I think there's a collaboration between government and industry is for me a key point.
And Laurence, given that sort of the Dementia Fund started off with government funding and as a government initiative, I'll give you the last word on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two areas that for sort of policies that I think have a big impact. So I comment on the extra stimulus for young companies. We have a couple of companies who, for example, have benefited from future fund money, by way of example, who've struggled there. So that's been very helpful. I think that the broader piece for me is about working with companies to develop new policies on regulatory, and to have the different agencies around the world be much more open-minded to the way we might have to or might want to develop drugs or might need to for different types of diseases. I think the cooperativeness there is becoming much greater, but I think we've all got a long way to go to be doing the right things for patients, and I think we've just got to bear that in mind. So from my perspective, and certainly in the dementia space, where we really struggle to have good models for some of these diseases, so we often have to ask clinical questions without the requisite support that you might normally have in other areas, then I think the open-mindedness for regulators, for example, to have to not necessarily have the same requirements, maybe different requirements to protect patients, but at the same time enable things to move forward. So I think a much more active dialogue, in that area, for example, I think would have huge impact.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll have to leave it there, and apologies for running over a couple of minutes, but just want to say a big thank you to the panel. You're all doing extremely great jobs for the most important sector right now, and I know you're all super busy, so thank you so much for taking the time out, and thank you to the audience for listening. If you do have any other questions, do feel free to reach out via email. I think the details are available with the flyer that came with the comment. And then thank you so much, everybody, and we will look forward to organizing another one of these soon. Thank you for listening, and thank you once again to our extremely great talent. And if everybody was here, I know there would be a round of applause, so I will certainly put my hands together for you all. Thanks so much. Thank you.